Welcome to the Aaron Harber Show. My special guest in part one of our two-part series is Jimmy Carter's former domestic advisor in the White House, Stuart Eizenstat. Stu, thanks so much for joining me.
Aaron, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's an honor having you, Ambassador Eizenstat, on the show. And I just was amazed at your book on the Carter presidency. And I want to talk about that because you were in it. The fact that you took over 5,000 pages of notes during the Carter presidency, you did 350 interviews for the book. At the beginning of the book, you have an extraordinary list of people talking about what an extraordinary tome it is. So, in fact, that was so long, it took me a while to wade through all the great comments, but of course that encourages people to read the book. Why do you think the Carter presidency was so underrated?
I think, Aaron, that he's the most unappreciated, underrated president we've had in any modern time. And I think the reason is that all of the successes, which I hope we'll have a chance to talk about, were overwhelmed by three things. The inter-party warfare we had with Ted Kennedy, which divided the Democratic Party all the way through the primaries and into the general election, double-digit inflation, and the Iran crisis. And those were so subsuming that they obscured all the major accomplishments that he made. And that's why I tried to write the book. It's an honest book and a candid book, and the New York Times and Washington Post and National Review have applauded it because in part it is so candid. So I don't ignore these problems, but they have obscured real accomplishments. He was, in my opinion, the single most accomplished one-term president we've had in modern American history. Almost 70% of all of our major legislation passed Congress. That's just under the legendary Lyndon Johnson's percentage. And by the way, he was my first boss in the White House in the Johnson years. So we accomplished an enormous amount. And what I did in the book is to try to show, not obscuring, not ignoring, not whitewashing the problems, but all the huge accomplishments that were done, both domestic and foreign, which again, I hope I'll have a chance to chat with you about.
Absolutely. I do want to talk about many of the specific topics that you address. What about the criticism of the president surrounding himself, not always with the best people, but he certainly has some extraordinary people, including yourself, of course. But in terms of his advisors, obviously Burt Lance, Hamilton Jordan, there was a lot of criticism of some of the Georgia mafia.
So I say, Aaron, that the rap on Carter's presidency is denominated by four I's: inflation, Iran, inter-party warfare, but inexperience on his part and on the Georgia mafia's part. And one of the great mistakes that was made was not bringing in a more experienced group to leaven. Every president who comes in always brings his top campaign aides. But in most instances, those are people who have been in Washington or who have some experience. Now, what did Reagan learn from our situation? He came from California. He was an outsider as well. He brought Jim Baker in as his chief of staff, who was a Washington insider. So yes, that was a major problem. Now, over time, this inexperienced crew became very experienced, but people form first impressions. And he combined that mistake by not having a chief of staff. So we overwhelmed Congress with energy, with tax reform, with the Panama Canal Treaty, with strategic arms talks, with so many initiatives that when we passed things, it always paled into comparison with everything we had sought. We didn't have that traffic cop, that experienced White House chief of staff to say, let's wait, we'll do this the next year, this is the third year, let's wait for a second term if there is one for this. Panama Canal is a great example. Rosalind, his first lady, his wife for now 72 years, begged him to wait on the Panama Canal Treaty to a second term because she knew it was so controversial. He said to her, Rosie, suppose there is no second term. So there wasn't, and he got Panama done. It transformed our relationship with Latin America, but it came at a huge political cost.
How do you think President Carter changed the course of the country? By the way, he's been a guest on my show, and I made the mistake. We were at the Democratic convention together a couple conventions ago. I made the mistake of handing him the microphone. and had to fight to get it back. So I mean, you're aware of how adept he is politically. He's not just a peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, obviously.
So let's take domestic and then foreign. On the domestic side, the energy security, Aaron, that we enjoy today, the lack of dependence on OPEC oil, comes from our three major energy bills. We deregulated the price of natural gas and crude oil to permit domestic production. We put conservation at the center of America's consciousness. We inaugurated the new clean energy, solar, wind. He put a solar panel on the White House to symbolize that. He was the greatest environmental president since Theodore Roosevelt, doubled the size of the whole national park system with the Alaska Lands Bill. The ethics legislation, which is, if I may say so, more important than ever now, special counsels, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, Inspectors General, the Ethics Act of '78 regulating what disclosures you had to make, gift limits, lobbying restrictions going out, that was all ours. And he was a great consumer champion. Instead of, as this administration has done, appointing people from industry to regulate their industries, he appointed consumer stalwarts, some from Ralph Nader's Raiders, and deregulated industries like airlines and trucking. He democratized the whole domestic airline industry, made it competitive. The JetBlues and Southwest wouldn't exist without that.
Back then there was People Express.
That was about it. The big carriers.
Well, thanks to the competition. I think a lot of people today don't realize that in that era, the government actually regulated airfares, and airlines had to get their airfares approved by the Civil
And they barred new entrants from coming in. And we didn't stop there. We deregulated telecommunications. The whole cable era started because of us. And for those of you in Denver and elsewhere who love your local craft beers, we even removed the Prohibition era restrictions on local craft beers. Foreign policy, even more enduring. Camp David and the Egypt-Israel peace agreement have lasted for 40 years. It's critical to Israel's security and to our national interest. And I have wonderful stories about, perhaps we can get into those, about how he cracked that nut at Camp David. He brought human rights into foreign policy, which is now being totally ignored by the administration. Applied it to right-wing dictators in Latin America, got tens of thousands of prisoners released, got the whole democracy movement in Latin America started, and did the same for the Soviet Union, championed the dissident democratic movements there, championed the Soviet Jewish movement, and according to Natan Sharansky, the leader now in Israel, but then in the Soviet Union, he saved Sharansky's life by saying he wasn't a spy. We normalized relations with China, and I got a great story about the first visit of Deng Xiaoping to see him. So all of these things were done, and additionally, Reagan deserves, and I give him all the credit for the military buildup that helped collapse the Soviet Union. But every study has now shown, including the new Pentagon study, that we started that buildup, Aaron. We started the reversal of the post-Vietnam decline in spending. All the major systems that Reagan put in place, the MX missile, the stealth bombers, intermediate nuclear forces in Europe, all of those were done beginning with Jimmy Carter. So he combined hard power with the Soviet Union, tough response to their invasion of Afghanistan, the Olympic boycott, and grain embargo, and soft power with human rights. So all of these things are huge, lasting accomplishments
that many people today don't know about. So we're going to talk about more of those with Ambassador Eizenstat when we return.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbertv.com.
I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. You can follow the show on Twitter for instant notification of new episodes, live event invitations, outtakes, and behind-the-scene photos. And tweet us your topic and guest suggestions today. I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. I very much would like to hear from you about the program, so please send me an email with your thoughts. You can suggest what topics I should cover, what guests I should invite to be on the show, or even what specific questions you would like me to ask. This is your program, so send your suggestions to Aaron@harbertv.com. I promise to personally read every one, so email me today. And most of all, thanks for watching.
Join me and watch the Aaron Harber Show.
Watch the Aaron Harber Show.
Watch the Aaron Harber Show.
Watch the Aaron Harper Show.
Watch the Aaron Harber Show.
I'm Reverend Jesse Jackson. Watch the Aaron Harber Show and Keep Hope Alive.
I'm Aaron Harber, host of the Aaron Harber Show. Find us on Facebook to get all the latest updates, see behind-the-scene photos, and make comments and ask me questions. You can see episodes before their TV broadcast, so like the show today.
The Aaron Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at harbortv.com.
Welcome back to the show. We are with Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, who of course was in the Carter White House. But Stu, before you were in the Carter White House, you actually worked on his campaign for governor. How did you get involved in that?
Well, first I was in the Johnson White House and then worked on Hubert Humphrey's presidential campaign. When he lost, Aaron, I went back to Atlanta where I grew up and volunteered to help him in his gubernatorial campaign. I was his policy director, and then that led to being policy director in his presidential campaign and then being his domestic policy advisor in the White House. And he had a very odd view of politics. He was an indefatigable campaigner. He was in Iowa for the caucuses 100 days. But his odd view of politics is once you're elected, you park politics at the Oval Office door and you do what he considered to be the right thing, taking on the Panama Canal, taking on the Middle East, taking on energy, thankless issues which had very little political resonance, thinking that if he did the right thing, he'd ultimately be rewarded at the end. He forgot one critical item, and this was, by the way, his strength and his weakness. His strength was he was willing to take these issues on, regardless of political consequences, but his weakness was the same. He forgot that a president is not only commander-in-chief, he's politician-in-chief. You have to keep a governing coalition together and behind you in order to succeed and to be reelected so you can do great things in a second term.
But don't you think, and I don't want to jump ahead to the Iran hostage crisis, but don't you think if it weren't for that, he probably would have won re-election?
I do think there were three things at the end that really were debilitating. The Kennedy challenge, which divided the party, inflation, and there he took his most courageous stand by appointing Paul Volcker to head the Federal Reserve, knowing that Volcker was going to squeeze inflation out of the economy by a tight monetary policy. And he said to us, Aaron, I've tried everything else to deal with inflation. I inherited it from Nixon and Ford. It's a decade-long problem. It's gotten worse under our tenure. I've tried everything else, tight budgets, wage and price guidelines, inflation czars. I'm going to take this stiff medicine. I would rather, he said this, lose the election than have my legacy be double-digit inflation. Volcker told him exactly what he was going to do, squeeze inflation out of the system, choke the economy, raise unemployment. The inflation rate didn't come down fast enough to help us in 80. It came down in the first year of Reagan's administration, and all of us are the beneficiaries of that ever since. But yes, Iran was the critical factor, even with inflation, even with the Kennedy challenge. If we hadn't had the Iranian hostage crisis for 444 humiliating, debilitating days, I think we would have won, and perhaps we can talk about that.
I do want to talk about that because my good friend Hadi Carter was the chief spokesman for the State Department. He was on TV every day. Of course, the TV stations had a counter. This is day 117. The next day, this is day 118. So, of course, it was the same as literally pounding the president publicly every day. But let's go to, you mentioned energy, and in your book you talk about, I mean, one of the themes, the moral equivalent of war. And certainly energy was a big part of the Carter administration in terms of at times gasoline shortages, oil and gas policy issues, deregulation you mentioned, promotion of solar and wind. Talk a little bit about the president's perspective on all this.
So the president surprised me, and I had been his policy director throughout the whole campaign. Energy was not a big issue. He decided to make it the #1 issue when he came into the Oval Office. Why? Because, Aaron, our dependence on Arab OPEC oil had gone past the 50% level. We were producing less at home. We were hostage to OPEC. And Richard Nixon was the first victim of that. He had gas lines. He had double-digit inflation because of the OPEC embargo after the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Carter said, this is a national security issue. I'm going to tackle it. And it was a brutal fight. We concluded the most difficult part, the natural gas deregulation, after 18 months of brutal hand-to-hand combat, appropriately in the map room of the White House where FDR charted the course of World War II, and it felt like we were charting the course of energy war, was something that would never happen today, bipartisanship. He really worked on this. We had 2 conservative Republican senators in the map room and 2 liberal Democratic congressmen
Who
to
were
agree.
they? Who were
so
they?
you had Corman and Rangel, you had Domenici and McClure. Also, Senator Danforth and other Republicans supported
So
this.
people like Pete Domenici, Jack Danforth, I mean, these are
McClure,
legendary figures
yes.
in the Senate.
And they were willing, which you don't see today, to really work together. Now, how did we make that happen? Well, you don't have the polarization we had today, but Carter did 2 things. We met religiously every week with the Democratic leadership for breakfasts
In the White House?
in the White House, just off the state dining room. But we also met every month with the Republican leadership. So we tried to bring them in. And our major accomplishments, the Panama Canal Treaty happened because Howard Baker, who was the Republican minority leader, supported it. Senator Hayakawa and other conservative Republicans supported it. Energy, all the other things, deregulation, were done on a bipartisan basis. Now, I don't want to make it appear there wasn't partisanship. Of course there was. But people were willing to go across the aisle when they were convinced that the national interest was at stake. You unfortunately don't see that today.
Well,
we worked very hard at it.
And I want to talk a little bit more about energy policy. I have a bias in that direction because during the time you were in the White House, I was over at the Department of Energy as a consultant coming just out of college.
Which we created. We
That's
created
right.
the department.
That's right. In fact, it was, I don't know if you know the name Lincoln Moses.
Yes, sure.
Great name, was the administrator of the Energy Information Administration.
Right.
I worked at EIA. I worked at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So I got to see all of this happening and the birth of DOE and all that, and just as basically a kid. So it was just a lot of fun for me. And that was because that came out of the fact that I had an argument with a very, well, I probably shouldn't say, but a very drunk Jim Schlesinger when he was Secretary of Energy. And we had this debate about how good a job he was doing, and I argued that he wasn't doing a good job. So he said, well, you come to Washington, young man, and you fix it. So I said, okay, I will. And 6 months later, I was
Well,
there.
you were a young man. I came into the White House as the President's Chief Domestic Advisor. I just had passed my 33rd birthday a few days before.
It's amazing, the opportunity.
But I mean, energy really is something critical. Today, we have very little dependence on OPEC oil. We are exporting natural gas. We're exporting crude oil. That came in significant part because we deregulated the prices, which Nixon had put on so that production could occur. We encouraged shale production. We put conservation at the centerpiece, the first fuel efficiency standards, insulation standards, and then now, Aaron, over 70% of our new electric power today comes from solar energy. We started the solar revolution with solar tax credits and symbolically by putting a solar panel on the White House, and I was standing right next to him when he did that. So energy is a huge accomplishment, and when you add that to being at the same time the greatest environmental president, doubling the size of the national park system, taking on very environmentally unfriendly, costly water projects, the ethics reforms that we put in, being a consumer champion and deregulating industries. It's a very important legacy, I think, that again has been overwhelmed by the very real problems that I talked about.
All right. We're going to take our last break. We'll be right back with Stu Eizenstat in just a moment.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbertv.com.
I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. You can follow the show on Twitter for instant notification of new episodes, live event invitations, outtakes, and behind-the-scene photos. and tweet us your topic and guest suggestions today.
The Rex Howell Broadcaster of the Year Award recognizes an individual who, through leadership, skill, and dedication, is advancing the broadcast industry in our state and our nation. Tonight, we honor Aaron Harber. Aaron has worked extensively in the media as a host, producer, political and economic commentator, and columnist. Today, the Aaron Harber Show is the focus of his media involvement. Aaron, it is a privilege to present you with the Rex Howell Broadcaster of the Year Award. Congratulations.
Just make journalism great again.
Used by fire professionals around the world, Fire Ice XT Spray is an eco-friendly, easy-to-use suppressant gel designed to quickly and efficiently stop and contain all kinds of fire and heat-related events, including fiberglass, lithium batteries, and other combustible up to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit for use in your home, office, RV, fireplace, boat, kitchen, and garage. For more information on Fire Ice XT Spray, visit us online at fireice.com.
I'm Aaron Harber, host of the Aaron Harber Show. I very much would like to hear from you about the program, so please send me an email with your thoughts. You can suggest what topics I should cover, what guests I should invite to be on the show, or even what specific questions you would like me to ask. This is your program, so send your suggestions to aaron@harbortv.com. I promise to personally read every one, so email me today. And most of all, thanks for watching. I'm Aaron Harber, host of the Aaron Harber Show. Find us on Facebook to get all the latest updates, see behind-the-scene photos, and make comments and ask me questions. You can see episodes before their TV broadcast, so like the show today.
The Aaron Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at harbortv.com.
Welcome back to the show. This is our final segment in part one of our special two-part series with Stuart Eizenstat. So, Stu, we've talked a little bit about the economy, but I don't think a lot of people remember what was going on at the time, because you had stagflation, you had high unemployment. At the same time, you had high interest rates. You had an economy that wasn't growing very fast. Huge economic challenge. You talked about the president's decision to kind of bite the bullet to address that. Do you think he would have made, knowing what happened and the fact that it took so long for the positive impacts of that to occur, would he have made the same decision knowing that today, knowing Jimmy Carter as you do?
Aaron, the only other way that this could have been addressed was to provoke a recession at the very beginning of the administration by tight money. But after all, we had run against Gerald Ford on the Ford recession. So our first actions were to stimulate the economy with tax cuts rather than to deal with inflation. Carter was the first among all of us to recognize the danger of inflation. In April of '77, 3 months after he was inaugurated, he gave his first anti-inflation speech. And he said we have to pay as much attention to inflation as we do unemployment. That was not a popular position for a Democrat to take. The problem is that during the Ford and Reagan periods, inflationary psychology had been embedded in our mentality. Increased wages led to increased prices led to increased demand for wages. And breaking that cycle was more difficult than any of us appreciated. He gave 5 major speeches with 5 policies on inflation, and it was only when all of them failed, including budget cuts that alienated some of the little wing, that he said to us, I'm ready to take the stiffest medicine. In '79, going into our reelection, I'm going to appoint Paul Volcker to head the Fed. And Volcker told him in a very famous Oval Office meeting I described, he said, Mr. President, if you appoint me, I'm going to raise interest rates, I'm going to squeeze inflation out of the system. It's going to be painful. During the entire 1980 election cycle, not once did Carter criticize the high interest rates. Not once. And Volcker, who applauded my book, endorsed my book, did an interview for my book, said Jimmy Carter was a real hero. He never interfered with what I had to do.
Well, of course, his predecessor was William Miller as the Fed.
Yes, and Bill was a good Secretary of the Treasury, but really an inadequate Fed chairman. He didn't appreciate that he should have tightened monetary policy up early in administration to avoid the cataclysmic efforts that we had to do toward the end. People also forget, as part of our economic legacy, we created, Aaron, 10 million jobs in 4 years. That's more than any 4-year period in American history up to the first term of Bill Clinton. And here's a Southern president from a gnat-infested 500-person hamlet in southwest Georgia. And what does he do? New York City is absolutely bankrupt. And he, in effect, does the loan guarantee and requires the kind of compromises that have now made New York City so vibrant. Everyone will tell you who knows anything about it, it was Jimmy Carter who bailed out New York City and prevented a catastrophic bankruptcy by the financial capital of the U.S. and the world. And then he did the same thing with Chrysler, which was also on its back.
Right. So, of course, those were in the Big Mac days in New York, in which the president then got involved after the formation of Big Mac.
Big Mac had started, but they told us they didn't have the resources. This was Felix Royaton, for example. They did not have the resources without the federal government's backup. And that's what we provided. The famous headline, not entirely fair to Ford, Ford to New York City dropped dead, because he didn't provide long-term guarantees. We did. It saved the city. It's revived the city. It's the great city that we know today.
So when you look at someone like, and I'm going to just briefly touch on Bill Miller, since Bill Miller, there have been no Fed chairmen appointed who are not academic economists until the current one, Jerome Powell. Do you have any concerns?
I don't, because Jerome Powell served on the Fed Board of Governors for a number of years under Janet Yellen, and he has a rock-solid reputation. So I have complete confidence in him. And I think what's happened, Aaron, is that Paul Volcker broke the mold. Alan Greenspan, who endorsed my book and who was for over 12 years the Fed chairman under the Republicans, again gives Jimmy Carter credit for appointing Volcker. Volcker is the one who broke the psychology of wage and price inflation. And he did it with Jimmy Carter's blessing, knowing the political costs that we had. Every Fed chairman since then has never let inflation get out of control. And we've all been the beneficiaries ever since.
During the administration, was there any consideration of implementing a value-added tax?
There wasn't, but I had actually recommended, unsuccessfully, that we do formal legal wage and price controls, which Nixon had done. Nixon did it as a way of getting through his re-election campaign. He put an artificial cap on and then removed the cap, inflation burst open. I sort of perhaps cynically said, let's do the same going into the re-election. And he said, no, we know the mistakes that were made for that. We'll do voluntary guidelines. We'll do procurement sanctions, so any company that does business with the government has to abide by our guidelines, but we're not going to do it on a mandatory basis. And even that didn't succeed. So in the end, that's when he said, I've tried everything. I'm going to take the stiff medicine, regardless of what it means for my re-election.
All right. Well, on that note, we're going to thank Stu Eizenstat. This is the end of part 1 of our special 2-part series with the ambassador. Make sure you watch part 2. I'm Aaron Harber. Thanks for watching.
Please contact us. We want to hear from you. And thanks for watching.